1 year, 2025. 25 men executed, 6 more remaining. 6 men, 6 execution dates, 6 different answers to the same question: who deserves to die? They weren't all serial killers. Some killed strangers, others killed lovers. One killed a child, and one never even meant to kill at all. But now they're all facing the same penalty: death row. First up, we head to Florida, a state that's been on an execution spree this year. 7 so far, with Michael B. Bell lined up as number 8. Bell is 54 now. He's been sitting on death row for nearly 30 years. And on July 15th, unless the courts intervene, the state of Florida plans to end his life by lethal injection. The crime happened in 1993, outside a Jacksonville bar called the Normandy Lounge. Bell was looking for trouble that night. He was looking for revenge. According to court records, in June 1993, a man named Theodore Wright killed Lamar Bell in self-defense, Bell's brother. On December 8, 1993, he bought an AK-47 rifle and ammunition through a girlfriend. The next night, he saw Wright's yellow Plymouth. Bell returned with 2 friends and the rifle, found the car in the parking lot of a liquor lounge in Jacksonville, and waited until its owner came out. Court records show Bell was unaware that Wright had sold the car to his half-brother, Jimmy West. When West left the lounge with Tameka Smith and another woman, Bell approached the car and fired 12 bullets into West and 4 into Smith at point-blank range, prosecutors said. Bell also fired at bystanders, riddling the front of the lounge before driving to his aunt's house and telling her, "Theodore got my brother, and now I got his brother." 19-year-old Jimmy West died at the scene, and 22-year-old Tameka Smith died on the way to the hospital. The other woman ducked and was uninjured. Bell was arrested in 1994 and convicted for the murders in 1995. He was later convicted of 3 other murders: a woman and her toddler son in 1989, and his mother's boyfriend about 4 months before the West Smith shooting. Bell's trial became a media circus in Jacksonville. The local newspapers covered every day of proceedings, and the victims' families packed the courtroom. Prosecutors hammered the idea that this wasn't just a shooting. It was reckless, cold-blooded, and pointless. The defense tried to argue that Bell was intoxicated, that he didn't mean to kill anyone, that he was aiming at someone else entirely, but the jury didn't buy it. After deliberating for just 4 hours, they returned guilty verdicts on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The judge, calling it a heinous and senseless act, handed down the death penalty. Over the next 3 decades, Bell filed appeal after appeal, claiming ineffective counsel, prosecutorial misconduct, and due process violations. He argued that his trial attorney failed to adequately investigate his background and mental health issues. All were denied. Now, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has signed Bell's death warrant, setting the execution for July 15th, 2025.
In a month, a man convicted in a 1993 double murder in Duval County is set to be executed. Michael Bell was shot and killed. Michael Bell shot and killed 2 people as they got in a car outside of a liquor lounge in Jacksonville. Bell thought he shot his brother's killer, but it turned out to be that man's half-brother. Today, Governor DeSantis signed his death warrant. He's scheduled to be executed July 15th.
Florida's execution spree continues. On July 31st, 2025, Edward Zakarzewski is scheduled to die by lethal injection for one of the most horrifying crimes in the state's modern history: the brutal murders of his wife and 2 children. It all began in Mary Esther, Florida, a quiet town in Okaloosa County. In June 1994, Edward Zakarzewski was an Air Force technical sergeant stationed at Hurlburt Field when his wife, Sylvia, sought a divorce and planned to return with their children to South Korea. Zakarzewski snapped. On the morning of June 9th, 1994, he murdered Sylvia Zakarzewski, striking her multiple times with a crossbar, then used a rope to strangle her. But he didn't stop there. Afterwards, Zakarzewski targeted his children, and firstly, he called his son, Edward Jr. into the bathroom to brush his teeth before he struck the 7-year-old boy repeatedly with the machete. Next, he summoned his 5-year-old daughter, Anna, to brush her teeth and killed her in similar fashion. Zakarzewski would later tell investigators he believed killing them was the only way to save them from growing up without a mother. After the murders, Zakarzewski tried to cover his tracks. He cleaned the crime scene, took the bodies to the bathtub, and packed a bag. Then he disappeared. He flew to Hawaii using a fake name. For 4 months, he lived under the alias Michael Green, staying in hostels and drifting around the islands. His escape almost worked until he saw himself featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries. The next day, on October 15, 1994, Zakarzewski walked into a police station in Honolulu and turned himself in. He told authorities he was tired of running. In 1996, Zakarzewski pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder. There was no trial over his guilt, only over his punishment. The penalty phase was emotional and contentious. The jury recommended the death penalty for the murders of Sylvia and Edward Jr., but life in prison for Anna. However, the judge overrode that recommendation and sentenced Zakarzewski to death on all 3 counts, citing the cruelty of the murders and the age of the children. In the words of the court, it was a calculated and merciless execution of an entire family. On July 1st, 2025, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed a death warrant for Edward Zakarzewski, scheduling his execution to be carried out on July 31st, 2025, at the Florida State Prison.
Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has signed the death warrant for a man who killed his wife and 2 children in Okaloosa County.
Our next stop is Tennessee, and what might be the most heartbreaking case on this list. Byron Black is scheduled to die by lethal injection on August 5th. He's 69 years old and has been on Tennessee's death row for over 35 years. His crime? The cold-blooded murder of a mother and her 2 daughters. On March 28, 1988, inside a small apartment in Nashville, Tennessee, Angela Clay, 29 years old, and her 2 daughters, Lakeisha, 9, and Latoya, just 6, were found shot to death in their home. The killer left no immediate clues, but what came to light would leave the community stunned. Angela Clay had recently separated from her husband, Benny Clay. At the time, she was in a relationship with Byron Lewis Black, a man who already had a violent history. Just over a year earlier, in December 1986, Black had shot and wounded Benny during an altercation. For that crime, he received a 2-year sentence, but was allowed work release. Then, during one of those temporary releases, Byron Black walked into Angela's apartment. Armed and unannounced, he entered the master bedroom and shot both Angela and Latoya. He then turned the gun on Lakeisha, who was in another room. The autopsy later revealed she had tried to defend herself. All 3 died from their injuries, each one the victim of a calculated close-range shooting. At first, there were no eyewitnesses and no forensic trail that led straight to Black, but investigators made a crucial connection. The bullets used in the murders matched those from the 1986 shooting of Benny Clay. It was the same weapon. That, along with growing circumstantial evidence, led to Byron Black's arrest. Black denied everything. He offered alibis that never held up in court. He even tried to avoid trial altogether by claiming mental incompetence. But on February 27, 1989, his trial began. And on March 8th, what would have been Lakeisha's 7th birthday, the jury returned 3 guilty verdicts for first-degree murder. The courtroom was silent as the judge handed down the death sentence. Prosecutors called it the most atrocious triple murder they'd ever seen. Since then, Byron Black has spent more than 3 decades on Tennessee's death row. His legal team has filed appeal after appeal, raising claims of ineffective counsel, mental illness, and intellectual disability. In every court, the verdict has remained unchanged.
Byron Black's team wants a new hearing to determine if he's competent enough to be executed, arguing that he can no longer understand why the state plans to kill him. Black is set to be executed August 5th after he was convicted of murdering Angela Clay and her 2 daughters back in 1988.
Then, in 2022, a new law in Tennessee gave Black another chance. It allowed death row inmates to challenge their sentences based on updated definitions of intellectual disability. In a surprising turn, the Davidson County District Attorney agreed that Black likely met the legal standard and should be removed from death row. But the court disagreed. He was first scheduled to die in October 2020, but that execution was postponed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Another date in 2022 was also delayed when Governor Bill Lee paused all executions for a statewide review of Tennessee's lethal injection protocol. That review is now complete, and the state has adopted a single drug method using pentobarbital. On March 3, 2025, the Tennessee Supreme Court officially set Byron Black's new execution date, August 5, 2025. He now remains on death row at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville. Now to Alabama. On August 22nd, David Lee Roberts, now in his late 50s, is scheduled to die using nitrogen hypoxia, a new and untested method. If carried out, he will become only the second person in American history to be executed this way. In 1992, Roberts was staying with a friend, Wendell Satterfield, in Jefferson County, Alabama, but that friendship unraveled fast. On April 22nd of that year, Roberts returned to Satterfield's house with a rifle, gasoline, and a motive fueled by anger and paranoia. Inside the house was 27-year-old Antra Jones, Satterfield's girlfriend. She was asleep on the living room couch. What happened next was brutal and calculated. Roberts shot Jones 3 times in the head with a .22 caliber rifle. Then he poured gasoline on her body, around the living room, and in the basement, setting the entire house on fire. The blaze destroyed the home and threatened nearby residences. After the fire, Roberts fled the scene, taking with him the murder weapon, stolen cash, and several firearms from the home. When police eventually caught up with him, Roberts confessed. He even led investigators to the hidden weapons stash. In his statements, he admitted to setting the fire in anger towards Satterfield, claiming Satterfield had made threats against Roberts' parents. But when asked why he killed Antra Jones, a woman who had nothing to do with that feud, Roberts offered no real explanation. He said only that he didn't know she'd be there. The case shocked the local community. At trial, prosecutors laid out Roberts' long criminal history, including burglary, theft, and the fact that he had been out on parole for less than 2 months when he committed the murder. They argued that the arson wasn't just to cover up the crime, it was part of it, a calculated act to ensure total destruction. The jury agreed. Roberts was convicted of capital murder and arson in 1994. He was sentenced to death. For the next 3 decades, Roberts would file appeal after appeal. He challenged everything from the evidence presented to the fairness of his trial, but all of it was denied. Now, his final fight is no longer about the crime. It's about how the state of Alabama plans to end his life. In June 2025, Governor Kay Ivey signed Roberts' death warrant, setting his execution for August 22nd.
David Lee Roberts was convicted of capital murder for the death of Anitra Jones. He was sentenced in 1994. Just a couple hours ago, the governor set a time for execution to be between August 21st and 22nd. Roberts is set to die by nitrogen hypoxia.
The state intends to use nitrogen hypoxia, a method that suffocates the person by replacing oxygen with pure nitrogen, causing unconsciousness followed by death. The state describes it as quick, painless, and humane. But the first nitrogen execution, carried out in January 2024 on Kenneth Eugene Smith, raised worldwide alarm. Smith reportedly convulsed violently, gasped for air, and appeared conscious far longer than expected. What was supposed to be a peaceful death dragged on for over 20 minutes, turning into a public relations disaster and raising serious constitutional concerns. Roberts' legal team is now fighting to stop his execution. They argue that Alabama is violating the Eighth Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. In their filings, they claim nitrogen hypoxia is experimental, unregulated, and capable of causing extreme psychological terror and panicked suffocation. But Alabama officials aren't backing down. They argue that Roberts has had more than enough time to exhaust his legal options and that nitrogen hypoxia is a lawful alternative to lethal injection, especially as drug shortages and public backlash make traditional execution methods harder to carry out. So now, with weeks left on the clock, the future of David Roberts hangs in the hands of the courts and possibly the U.S. Supreme Court. If no intervention comes, Roberts will become the latest face in America's deadly experiment with nitrogen gas. Now, we head to Texas, where executions are routine. But this one, it's anything but routine. On September 25th, Blaine Millam, now 35, is scheduled to be executed by lethal injection. And if the date holds, he'll be put to death on his birthday. A macabre coincidence that has drawn national attention to one of the most disturbing cases in recent memory. Millam's case is infamous in East Texas, and for good reason. The crime he committed defies understanding and challenges our most basic assumptions about human nature. In 2008, Millam was 18 years old and living with his girlfriend, Jessica Carson, in Rusk County. Carson had a 13-month-old daughter, Amora Bain Carson. On the surface, they appeared to be a young family trying to make it work, but behind closed doors, something sinister was developing. According to their own statements to police, Millam and Carson had become convinced that baby Amora was possessed by demons. They claimed they were witnessing supernatural events, that the baby's eyes would change color, that she would speak in languages they didn't recognize, that objects in the house would move on their own. Mental health experts would later testify that both Millam and Carson were suffering from shared psychotic disorder, feeding off each other's delusions and paranoia. The medical examiner's report makes for difficult reading. Amora, the 13-month-old child, had over 20 separate injuries covering her tiny body. There were skull fractures consistent with blunt force trauma, bite marks on her arms and legs, human bite marks that matched both Millam's and Carson's dental impression, bruises in various stages of healing, indicating prolonged abuse, burns on her hands and feet, a broken leg that had never been treated, and finally, the fatal injury, severe blunt force trauma to the head that caused massive brain swelling. On the final day, Millam called 911, claiming that the baby had fallen down the stairs. But when paramedics arrived, they immediately recognized that Amora's injuries were not consistent with a fall. The baby was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. She died within hours of arrival. The investigation was swift and thorough. When confronted with the medical evidence, both Millam and Carson eventually confessed to what they'd done. They described their actions in chilling detail, still insisting that they'd been trying to save the baby from demonic possession. Carson agreed to testify against Millam in exchange for a life sentence without parole. Her testimony was devastating. She described how Millam had become increasingly violent toward the baby, how he'd convinced her that more extreme measures were necessary to drive out the demons. The trial was one of the most difficult in East Texas history. Prosecutors had to present the gruesome evidence while maintaining their composure. Photos of Amora's injuries were shown to the jury, causing several jurors to break down in tears. Medical experts testified that the child had suffered for hours, possibly days, before her death. Millam's defense team tried to argue mental impairment. They brought in psychiatrists who testified that Millam had an IQ below 70 and suffered from severe mental illness. They argued that he was not competent to stand trial and was not eligible for the death penalty under Supreme Court precedent, prohibiting the execution of mentally disabled defendants. But the prosecution presented their own experts who disputed these claims. They argued that while Millam might have mental health issues, he was not intellectually disabled and was fully aware of his actions. They pointed to evidence that Milam had tried to cover up the crime, demonstrating consciousness of guilt. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict on capital murder charges. The penalty phase was equally swift. They sentenced Milam to death.
Blaine Milam from Rusk was convicted of capital murder for the death of a 13-month-old in December of 2008. You can see his picture here. Milam was set for lethal injection for killing the toddler and what he and his girlfriend say was part of an exorcism.
Now, 17 years later, the state of Texas says it's ready to carry out the sentence. Milam will be strapped to a gurney, administered a lethal dose of pentobarbital, and die on the same day he was born 35 years earlier. Missouri is preparing for its next execution. On October 14, 2025, Lance Shockley is scheduled to die by lethal injection for the 2005 murder of Missouri State Highway Patrol Sergeant Carl Dwayne Graham Jr. The case sent shockwaves through Missouri's law enforcement community, not just because of the crime itself, but because the victim was one of their own. On March 20, 2005, Sergeant Carl Graham Jr. was found shot to death inside his patrol car, parked in the driveway of his home in Van Buren, Missouri. Graham, a 12-year veteran of the Missouri State Highway Patrol, had been shot twice in the head at close range. He was still wearing his uniform. Investigators determined that Graham had been investigating Lance Shockley in connection with a fatal 2004 car crash. Prosecutors later argued that Shockley murdered Graham to prevent him from testifying before a grand jury and to derail the investigation. Shockley quickly became the prime suspect. He had no alibi, and gunshot residue was found on his hands. Ammunition matching the bullets used in the murder was discovered in his home, and tire tracks found near the crime scene matched his vehicle. The murder weapon was never recovered, but forensic and circumstantial evidence linked him to the killing. Due to intense media coverage in Carter County, the trial was moved to Cape Girardeau. In 2009, Lance Shockley was convicted of first-degree murder. Prosecutors described the crime as a calculated ambush carried out to silence a law enforcement officer who posed a threat to Shockley's freedom. Sergeant Graham, they emphasized, was shot execution style while still in his patrol vehicle, a symbolic act of defiance against the rule of law. Shockley's defense claimed the case was built on circumstantial evidence, arguing that there was no direct link to the murder weapon and no eyewitnesses, but the jury was unconvinced. After just 3 hours of deliberation, they returned a guilty verdict and sentenced him to death. In June 2025, Governor Mike Parsons signed the death warrant, officially scheduling the execution for October 14, 2025. Shockley is set to be executed at the Eastern Reception, Diagnostic, and Correctional Center in Bonne Terre, Missouri, the site of all recent executions in the state.
The Supreme Court has set an execution date for Lance Shockley. The 48-year-old Missouri man was convicted of murdering a Missouri State Highway Patrol trooper in 2005. Just before his death, Sergeant Carl Dwayne Graham was investigating a deadly crash involving Shockley where the driver left the scene.
This was a guy who has never shown mercy to any one of these victims. He's never shown sympathy. He's never shown compassion or concern. The only thing he's ever shown is selfishness, self-centeredness, and whatever Wayne wants, Wayne gets.
Harold Wayne Nichols has been on Tennessee's death row since 1990, making him one of the state's longest-serving death row inmates. His execution is now scheduled for December 11, 2025, marking what may be the final execution in Tennessee that year. On September 30th, 1988, Nichols brutally raped and murdered 21-year-old Karen Pulley in her Chattanooga home. Pulley, a college student, was attacked after Nichols entered her residence. He sexually assaulted her, beat her, and strangled her to death. Her body was discovered by police after she failed to show up for work. Nichols was arrested shortly afterward and later confessed to the crime. DNA evidence and his own statements confirmed his involvement. In 1990, He was convicted of first-degree murder, aggravated rape, and aggravated burglary, and sentenced to death.
The so-called red-headed stranger was a serial rapist who was given the death penalty over killing one of his victims.
Nichols has pursued numerous appeals over the past 3 decades, challenging his conviction and sentence on multiple grounds, including claims of mental illness, ineffective counsel, and Tennessee's execution protocols. In 2020, just days before a scheduled execution, a federal court granted a temporary stay to assess Nichols' mental competency. However, after further psychological evaluations, the courts ruled that Nichols understood the nature of his punishment and could be executed. In 2024, the Tennessee Supreme Court rescheduled his execution for December 11, 2025. Under Tennessee law, because Nichols was sentenced before 1999, he has the option to choose between lethal injection or the electric chair. According to court filings, Nichols has chosen lethal injection. The case continues to divide public opinion in Tennessee, with some calling it long overdue justice for Karen Pulley's family, and others questioning the ethics of executing someone nearly 4 decades after the crime. Unless a last-minute appeal is granted, Harold Wayne Nichols will be executed in December, closing one of Tennessee's most drawn-out capital cases. So now you know their names, their crimes, their final dates. 6 men, 6 stories, 6 different paths to the same destination, the death chamber. But here's the real question that haunts this entire discussion. Should they all die?